Like someone who suddenly has the water removed from his pool and is shown to have been bathing without a suit, Nicolás Maduro was left naked before the international community. Everyone suspected it, some claimed it, but Maria Corina Machado took it upon herself to document the truth as no one had ever done before, demonstrating the manipulation of the regime. Venezuela lost its image of a sovereign democracy, and with its scandalous fraud, it showed the world the reality of being a bloody dictatorship in decline, and is now close to being treated as such. In this report, we are going to show you what everyone knows, but no one says about the imminent international action against the dictatorship and, above all, the foundations of it. All countries took note of Maduro's illegal actions, except those that are committed to the continuation of drug trafficking, money laundering, smuggling of resources, and the annulment of civil liberties. But what Maria Corina showed is only a small part, because what is happening is much worse and has already set off the alarms of a process that will have such a predictable end that there is no need to anticipate anything. We are already in extra time. We will return to the subject at the end, but let us look at what is happening in more detail so that the reason for all the actions that are coming against the regime is clearly understood, so that the connected ones, the Boliburgueses and those who colonize their minds so that they will be poor forever, stop using the trite arguments provided by the most fascist regime in Venezuelan history to deny their own condition, 4.4 tons of cocaine. That is the amount recently seized on the border between Guyana and Venezuela. And this is not an isolated incident. Drug trafficking in Venezuela is no longer an open secret. It is a business in broad daylight, protected and even promoted by the government itself. This report exposes that Venezuela has gone from being a prosperous nation to a narco-state that threatens the stability of all of Latin America. We will review the dark links between the Maduro regime, drug cartels, and even terrorist groups such as Hezbollah. The question is no longer whether Venezuela represents a threat, but how long do you think they will continue to ignore the risk? Venezuela, the country of contradictions. In the 80s and 90s, it was Latin America's golden dream, a country rich in oil, with a thriving economy and a stable democracy. Venezuelans enjoyed an enviable standard of living in the region, with a strong currency and abundant opportunities. And of course, they had some problems, like everyone else in the region. But today, that prosperous Venezuela is just a distant memory. The economic and social crisis has devastated the country. Hyperinflation has pulverized the purchasing power of Venezuelans. Unemployment has skyrocketed and poverty affects more than 90% of the population. Food and medicine shortages have become chronic, and there are no reliable statistics on the magnitude of the problem. Millions of Venezuelans fled the country in the largest migration crisis in the history of Latin America, and there is no free press that freely reflects what is happening in the country. How could we get to this point? The answer has two people responsible: Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro. The Chavista regime destroyed the economy with populist policies and disastrous management, opening the doors to organized crime. Venezuela became a true narco-state from which government institutions became the base from which all kinds of illicit activities are controlled. This corrupt money is what allows them to sustain the economic bribes they provide to the top brass of the military and police forces that support them. These armed forces are the ones that guarantee, with repression, violence and prison, that they can keep their entire population kidnapped even after losing the elections in an electoral beating that they did not endure. The examples of government corruption are scandalous. The case of the narco nephews is emblematic. Two nephews of Kilia Flores, Maduro's wife, were arrested in Haiti trying to traffic 800 kilos of cocaine to the United States. Another flagrant example is that of Diosdado Cabello, considered the number 2 of the regime. The United States accuses him of being the leader of the Cartel de los Soles, a drug trafficking organization formed by high-ranking Venezuelan military officers. The smuggling of gold and the emptying of the country have already been denounced in previous reports, but the international community so far has only reacted lukewarmly. Venezuela's transformation is dramatic. From being a reliable economic partner and a stable country, it has ended up becoming the main exporter of organized crime in the region. The consequences for neighboring countries are serious and multifaceted. Colombia faces a new threat from the east. Peru and Ecuador are concerned about how Venezuelan criminal networks are expanding in their territories. The Venezuelan crisis generated an unprecedented wave of migration in the region. Millions of Venezuelans have had to flee to neighboring countries, putting enormous pressure on their health, education, security, and employment systems. And among these desperate migrants, members of criminal organizations are infiltrating, seeking to expand their operations. They advance like a disease that spreads silently. All the presidents of the region know about it, but very few do anything concrete. Until the shameful electoral fraud, the leaders avoided dealing with the issue in public and only did so behind closed doors and without informing the press. Today, the issue is on presidential agendas and actions are coordinated in secret. The threat posed by Venezuela under Maduro is real, growing and spreading like an infectious disease. We are no longer talking about an internal problem of a country, but a regional crisis that puts the stability and security of the entire continent at risk. 6 years of Maduro is something that, with the exception of Cuba and Nicaragua, no other country on the continent is willing to endure. In the next segment, we will review how a criminal group born in Venezuelan prisons became one of the most feared criminal organizations in the region. The Aragua Train is living proof of how the chaos in Venezuela is spreading beyond its borders. The Aragua Train is the scourge of Latin America. It is the expansion of terror as a way of life. This Venezuelan criminal organization, born in the bowels of the Tocoron prison in the state of Aragua, has become a regional threat that reflects the reigning chaos in Venezuela. The Venezuelan migration crisis was the fertile ground for its expansion. The Tren de Aragua gang has infiltrated its members among desperate migrants, establishing cells in Colombia, Peru, and Chile. The figures for their growth are alarming. In Colombia, they take advantage of drug trafficking routes. In Peru, extortion and violence are skyrocketing. Chile, once peaceful, is now the scene of their illicit activities and the most cruel murders. The United States already has the first detainees in its main cities who share the same modalities and tattoos as the rest of the members in South America. Immigration offices and security ministries are sharing information, and it is evident that the infection has spread to the north and south. Their tactics are extremely brutal. Indiscriminate violence, widespread extortion, and human trafficking are their modus operandi. The testimonies of the victims are heartbreaking. Displaced families, closed businesses, communities plunged into fear, and a risk that grows wherever they operate. Why does the Maduro regime allow this? The answer is terrifying: complicity. The Venezuelan government not only tolerates the Tren de Aragua, but actively collaborates with them. It provides them with false identities and allows them to operate without reprisals within Venezuela. This criminal organization has become a useful tool for Maduro, an arm of state terrorism that commits crimes on commission in countries where his regime is critical. The brutal murder of former Venezuelan military officer Ronald Ojeda in Chilean territory revealed the reality of what had been suspected. The regime kills through them. Ojeda's case brought to mind the darkest periods of South American military dictatorships and their Plan Condor, which had the same objective: to kill opponents wherever they are. The lack of action by the Venezuelan authorities is eloquent. While the Tren de Aragua expands its empire of terror, in Venezuela they operate with total impunity. Prisons are their headquarters, from where they coordinate transnational operations, receiving weapons and instructions with total impunity. Fighting terrorism requires a coordinated response from all governments in the region. However, the lack of cooperation from the Venezuelan regime makes this task almost impossible. The question is no longer whether the Aragua Train is a real threat, but how much longer can the region contain its advance without addressing the root problem? The solution inevitably involves a change in Venezuela. As long as the country remains mired in fraud, chaos, and corruption, it will continue to be an exporter of crime and violence to all of America. Our report wants to highlight that this criminal network is expanding criminal activity throughout America, both in the South and also in the North, with a presence in the United States, and the complicity of the Maduro regime is the key to its success. Already in the time of Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro, Venezuela and Cuba had set out to contaminate capitalist societies, which they consider their demonized imperialist enemy, by filling them with drugs, facilitating drug trafficking routes, protecting their members, and earning a good income for it. Today, this model has made great strides and has found new markets in Europe and the Middle East, coordinating activities with much more dangerous allies. The connection between Hezbollah and the Maduro regime is a threat that defies all logic. What does the Lebanese terrorist group have to do with Venezuela? It is very important to review how Venezuela became a strategic ally for this terrorist organization, with alarming consequences for all of Latin America. The Maduro government has taken an unprecedented step, providing false documents to members of Hezbollah. This is not a simple accusation, but a proven fact. Venezuelan passports, identity cards, even diplomatic documents were given to Hezbollah operatives, allowing them to move freely throughout the region with impunity. Can you imagine the danger this represents for other countries? An emblematic case of this forgery network is that of the Lebanese terrorist Hussein Ahmad Karaki, a key figure in Hezbollah operations in Latin America. Karaki, involved in the terrorist attacks in Argentina, used false documents to move between countries, demonstrating the sophistication of this criminal network. But the collaboration goes further. There is evidence of high-level meetings, information exchange and logistical support between Venezuelan officials and Hezbollah. The Maduro regime not only provides documents, but a complete base of operations.
El informe del Centro de Pensamiento Atlantic Council asegura que la operación de Hezbollah se materializa a través de 3 clanes. Muchos de ellos se localizan en zonas estratégicas de Venezuela, cerca de puertos y costas.
The impact on regional security is devastating. Hezbollah uses Venezuela as a platform for its criminal activities, drug trafficking, money laundering, and smuggling. All of this under the protection of the Venezuelan regime. How vulnerable is the region to this threat?
De acuerdo con la revista Forbes, de la lista de organizaciones calificadas por Estados Unidos como terroristas, Hezbollah sería la más rica del mundo, con $1.100 millones en 2018. Dinero que en parte vendría de operaciones de narcotráfico en América Latina.
Hezbollah se convirtió en el socio ideal. La sofisticación financiera, su integración con comunidades completas, a cargo de desarrollo urbano e inmobiliario en el Brasil, a cargo de operaciones financieras complejas en el Medio Oriente, a cargo de operaciones bancarias desde el nivel primario hasta el nivel más alto en Líbano, le dieron la capacidad de ser quien blanqueaba y facilitaba el flujo de recursos para regímenes como el de Nicolás Maduro en Venezuela.
With Venezuelan passports, Hezbollah operatives can establish sleeper cells and plan attacks anywhere in Latin America. History has shown us their ability to carry out devastating attacks. Do you think the international community will wait for another to occur before acting? The complicity of the Maduro regime in these activities can no longer be ignored. Venezuela has become an active exporter of terrorism, endangering the stability of the entire region. Every day that passes without decisive action by the international community is another day in which Hezbollah consolidates its presence. For Maduro, this means income to sustain his power, but the cost is paid by the entire region that until now passively watched as one of the most economically powerful organizations lays solid foundations in the economy of all of America.
¿Pero cómo funciona este organigrama operativo? Según Hacha, el sistema de blanqueo de capitales en el hemisferio occidental comienza con el envío de droga desde países como Venezuela o Bolivia a Estados Unidos y Europa. Los recursos generados se centralizan a través de operadores financieros de Hezbollah que tienen la capacidad de insertarlos en actividades legales a escala global.
Si el Departamento de Estado considera que existe una relación entre Venezuela y Hezbollah, ¿qué previene a Estados Unidos de incluir a Venezuela como país que patrocina el terrorismo?
How much longer can this time bomb be ignored? The security of millions of Latin Americans is at stake. In this report, we have shown you the stark reality of this dangerous alliance, and no one can be so naive as to believe that this terrorist group does not have its reasons for targeting Latin America. The question now is, what will the authorities of each nation do about it? The history of the attacks in Buenos Aires is a grim reminder of the threat posed by Hezbollah in Latin America. In 1992 and 1994, the Argentine capital was rocked by 2 devastating explosions that left 114 dead and more than 300 injured. These figures, however, do not begin to describe the horror that was experienced in the streets of the city. And do you know how Hezbollah managed to carry out these attacks thousands of kilometers from its base? The answer reveals a network of complicity that would eventually extend to Venezuela. Hussein Ahmad Karaki, identified as the mastermind behind the attacks, used false documents to enter Argentina. This practice, which years later would be perfected with the help of the Venezuelan regime, was only the beginning of a much more complex operation. The Israeli ambassador to Costa Rica, Michal Gur-Aryeh, revealed a lot of information, but among it, a chilling fact. The attacks in Argentina were handled from the Iranian embassy in Buenos Aires. This statement reveals the close collaboration between Hezbollah and the Iranian regime, an alliance that remains a threat to the region. But the plot becomes even more complicated when we look at Venezuela's role in this story. Years after the attacks, the Venezuelan government began to facilitate the issuance of IDs and passports to members of Hezbollah, passports that they deny to their own inhabitants or that they annul to complicate the lives of Venezuelans, but they do not stop issuing to their strategic allies in drug trafficking and gold smuggling. The Maduro government's objectives are very clear: to maintain the funds that allow the kidnapping of the entire country to continue. It is incredible that some Venezuelans do not notice this. The link with Hezbollah in Venezuela has been initially managed by the now deceased Tarek El Aissami, former governor of Aragua and former vice president under Nicolás Maduro, who is now reportedly detained by the regime itself, although some sources say that he is actually a refugee in Iran. In 2007, a Lebanese nationalized Venezuelan named Ghazi Nasreddine was appointed as second in command at the Venezuelan embassy in Syria, from where 10,000 passports were issued in 2008 and 2009 alone. Do you realize the seriousness of this? A Latin American government actively helping a terrorist organization to move around the region to plan its objectives. Almost 3 decades after the attacks, these cases remain completely unresolved. Argentina's Security Minister Patricia Bullrich said that Karachi continues to operate from Lebanon. How much longer do they think passive international diplomacy will allow these terrorists to act with impunity on our continent? The question we must ask ourselves is disturbing. Could something similar happen again in other countries in the region? Cooperation between Hezbollah and organized crime in Latin America has grown in recent years. The support network they have woven with the complicity of governments, such as those of Nicaragua and Venezuela, increases the risk of future attacks. The attacks in Buenos Aires should be a constant reminder of the threat posed by international terrorism in our region. The lack of resolution of these cases and the growing presence of Hezbollah in Latin America, facilitated by regimes such as Maduro's, are a clear warning. The security of all of America is at stake, and it is time for concrete security measures to be taken to confront this threat. The Triple Frontier, the point where Argentina, Brazil and Paraguay meet, has become the epicenter of Hezbollah's operations in Latin America. Far from being a simple geographical curiosity, this area is a paradise for money laundering, illegal fundraising and smuggling. How did a terrorist organization from the Middle East manage to dominate this corner of South America? The strategic importance of the Triple Frontier is undeniable. It is a meeting point for 3 countries with different legislations, creating legal loopholes that organized crime has known how to take advantage of. Since the 1980s, Hezbollah has been weaving a complex network in this region, combining illicit activities with political and economic alliances. The collaboration between Hezbollah and local criminal groups in the Triple Frontier is alarming. Commissioner Carlos Benitez, director of Paraguay's Secretariat for the Prevention of Terrorism, has pointed out well-founded suspicions that elements of Hezbollah are involved in drug trafficking. This cooperation has allowed the terrorist organization to expand its operations, taking advantage of the networks already established in the region, increase its financing and help Maduro to obtain funds through these lucrative activities of mutual benefit. Cases of money laundering and terrorist financing are numerous and worrying. Musa Ali Hamdan, a Hezbollah leader, was arrested in Paraguay and deported to the United States on charges of arms trafficking and providing false passports. Asad Ahmad Barakat, considered one of Hezbollah's main financiers in the area, was arrested in Brazil for money laundering and drug trafficking. Authorities face enormous challenges in controlling the Triple Frontier. Corruption, lack of cooperation between countries, and the complexity of criminal operations make it difficult to fight organized crime and terrorism. The lack of government control has created an environment conducive to Hezbollah operating with impunity, with its members circulating legally throughout the region under false identities that cover their true activities. From the triple border, Hezbollah coordinates its operations throughout Latin America, taking advantage of the porosity of the borders and institutional weakness. It is a crucial hub for the movement of money, weapons, and people linked to international terrorism. The implications for the security of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay are serious and far-reaching. Hezbollah's presence not only represents a direct threat to these countries, but serves as a platform to expand its activities to other Latin American nations. The flow of illicit money weakens local economies, while collaboration with criminal groups increases levels of violence and corruption. Even former allies of Nicolás Maduro, Lula da Silva and Gustavo Petro have understood that the situation is unsustainable because of the risks it entails for Brazil and Colombia. Since Milei took office, Argentina has reversed the suspicious relaxation of controls that Kirchnerism had, an ally of Maduro, Lula, Petro, and Cuba, all with borders permeable to these activities and very opaque campaign financing. The situation in the Triple Border is a disturbing reminder of how international terrorism managed to establish a solid base in the heart of South America. While the authorities struggle to contain this threat, Hezbollah continues to strengthen its presence and expand its operations in complicity with Maduro. The security of all Latin America is at stake, and time to act is running out day by day. The connection between Latin American drug trafficking and terrorism in the Middle East is deeper than many imagine. Hezbollah, the Lebanese terrorist organization, found unexpected but extremely lucrative allies in the region's drug cartels. This macabre alliance turned Venezuela into the epicenter of an international drug trafficking operation that finances terror on the other side of the world. The Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence agency, has been identifying for decades the activities of the Iranians, the relationships with Venezuelan officials, and even the money and drug trafficking routes that link the Iranians and Latin Americans recruited by Hezbollah with the activities that finance the operations of Venezuela and Cuba. Have you ever wondered how this global network really works? The answer is the very justification of the international agenda meetings that Senator Marco Rubio, future Secretary of State of Donald Trump, is holding to fully combat this problem that we are detailing as a preview of what is coming. Hezbollah from Latin America provides strategic advice and weapons to the drug cartels, while they offer their well-established trafficking networks. This collaboration ended up creating a very dangerous synergy that is expanding the operations of both groups. The trafficking routes from Venezuela to Europe and the Middle East are as sophisticated as they are alarming. The DEA has identified Venezuela as a crucial hub for drug trafficking. A chilling fact: planes registered in the name of PDVSA have been detected being used to transport drugs. This is not a coincidence, it is a covert state operation. Drug trafficking money becomes a lethal weapon in the hands of Hezbollah. The income generated by drug trafficking is used to buy weapons, finance terrorist operations, and maintain the organization's infrastructure in Lebanon and LAN. Other countries, it is a vicious cycle. Latin American drugs are transformed into violence and terror in the Middle East. The magnitude of this operation is difficult to understand because it is constantly changing and its information is, in general, classified. We are talking about a constant flow of money that crosses oceans and borders, circumventing international controls and fueling conflicts in distant regions. Every gram of cocaine that leaves Venezuela could be financing a terrorist attack anywhere in the world. This situation has gotten out of hand, even in countries like Colombia and Brazil, which until recently tried to support Maduro until the dictator's desperate economic need began to significantly increase trafficking, making everything undisguisable and very dangerous. How much money from Latin American drug trafficking is financing terrorism? The estimates are alarming. It is believed that Hezbollah could be generating around $1 billion annually from its drug trafficking activities. This figure far exceeds what they receive from other sources of financing, becoming their main economic support. The question we must ask ourselves is no longer whether Venezuela is a threat to international security, but how much longer this situation can be allowed to continue. Drug trafficking not only destroys lives in Latin America, but now also finances terror in the Middle East, which has generated that Mossad agents are already on active missions and awaiting increasingly imminent, coordinated action. How many more lives will be lost before the international community takes decisive action against this narco-state that has become the best ally of global terrorism? Donald Trump announced that his government will be one of peace, but will arrive by way of the preventive elimination of conflicts. And it is clear that if Maduro takes office in January for a new term for which everyone knows he committed fraud, the conflict is evident. It is an open secret that he will not take office, but stay until the end, as we will reveal the details as they become known. Drug money in Venezuela not only crosses borders, but becomes a global threat. How is it possible that the dollars generated in the offices of the regime's cronies end up financing attacks in Beirut? The money laundering network that we want to expose is only comparable to those in spy films and ranges from cocaine to bombs in a financial journey that defies logic. Money laundering on an international scale is a complex process that involves multiple layers of transactions to hide the illicit origin of the funds. In the case of Hezbollah and Venezuela, this process has been perfected to the point of becoming a dark art. Ghost companies, from clothing stores to travel agencies, serve as entry points for dirty money into the banking system. In addition, the hawala system, an informal method of transfer based on trust, makes it difficult for authorities to track. A concrete case that illustrates the magnitude of these operations is one that was discovered by the DEA in 2008. The so-called Operation Cassandra revealed that Hezbollah was involved in a network that collected approximately $1 billion annually for terrorist activities. This money came largely from Latin American drug trafficking and was laundered through an intricate network of companies and banks around the world. Rachel Ehrenfeld, director of the American Center for Democracy, noted that the welcoming relations that these governments have with Iran facilitate the free movement of Hezbollah members in the region, allowing them to transport drugs and counterfeit products. This statement underlines how government complicity is essential to the success of these laundering operations. Venezuela became, out of necessity and convenience, a crucial link in the chain that connects Latin American drug trafficking with terrorism in the Middle East. The money that enters Caracas dirty comes out clean to Beirut, ready to finance terrorist operations. It is a perverse cycle where corruption feeds violence and violence generates more corruption. The escalation of violence in the Middle East only sharpened all operations that can neutralize the sources of financing, and when Israel traces the funds, the roots point to the same Caribbean country that they already had in their sights, but were always stopped by Joe Biden's lukewarm policy. Senator Marco Rubio, who will take office in January, has already met with Javier Milei in Argentina in the first days of his assumption as president and is also receiving the latest classified intelligence reports on the particular situation in Venezuela, of which he recalled that the Maduro regime is not a typical South American dictatorship, but a criminal consortium formed by high-ranking military officers and regime officials involved in a series of illicit operations ranging from drug trafficking and money laundering to gold smuggling and widespread embezzlement of government funds. It is clear that the international community no longer sees the Venezuelan government as a democracy, but as a true dictatorship without the slightest scruples to take lies to a fantastical extreme. Maduro's tyranny has already proven that it is capable of manipulating all the institutional springs of the country at its exclusive whim and convenience. It also proved that it was possible to fool the world for decades by disguising itself as a sovereign democracy. But since Maria Corina Machado and her cronies revealed the truth, any doubt about how they actually operated was dispelled. It is clear that Maduro and his accomplices are now trying to rearrange their speeches since Donald Trump's victory in the United States was announced. But everyone knows that he needs to contaminate neighboring countries with drugs and terrorism to finance the continuity of his government. On his last international trip, it was clear to Maduro's entourage that they are not welcome even in the BRICS community. But at least when they returned with the 3 private planes, they were able to make the necessary stops on their illegal route to return with fresh money to extend the agony of their power. The entire itinerary was tracked, identified and presented in a detailed report that is already in the hands of Marco Rubio, who in addition to being one of the strongest critics of the Venezuelan dictatorship, will now have the real power in his hands to turn American diplomacy into a real nightmare for Nicolás Maduro and other leaders. There are very large interests in the world that benefit from terrorism and drug trafficking, continuing to finance the governments that provide cover for them. But can anyone believe that such an obvious and proven situation can continue to exist? The answer is a unanimous and resounding no, but it must be acknowledged that the most appropriate date for the possible intervention is still being discussed, since Trump would not take office until January 20th and the other countries expected it to be resolved long before the 10th, but the complicit lukewarmness of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris ended up contributing to confusion. If the bureaucratic proposals are finally put in order, Venezuela could live a real Christmas, even if Maduro believes it was in October. The dirty money that is circulating through the international financial system and that is covering the Maduro government with these operations turned out to be much larger than one could imagine. The estimates are astonishing and frightening. If Hezbollah alone manages to move $1 billion annually, the total amount of money laundered globally managed to become an astronomical value. Intelligence services believe that every dollar that passes through this corrupt system is a dollar that could be financing the next terrorist attack. The money laundering network that connects Caracas to Beirut is a testament to the sophistication and global reach of organized crime and terrorism. It is a challenge that requires a coordinated and forceful response from the international community, to the point that the result of the US elections had to be awaited in order to know if there would be a passive continuation or a real change in the joint policy that will be had with the Maduro regime, now that its fraud was categorically proven by Maria Corina Machado. The international community also knows that many Venezuelans have lost hope and believe that the rest of the world has abandoned them in the hands of the dictator, but 5 months is nothing in a well-planned action that will require coordinated actions on many fronts. Can anyone believe that other democratic countries will allow the continuation of this flow of dirty money to fuel terror and violence around the world? The Israeli ambassador to Costa Rica's denunciation of Hezbollah bases in Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Venezuela is only the beginning of the messages that will expose this terrifying reality. The true extent of this terrorist organization in Latin America exceeds what any government publicly admits. Not all the reports are available, but there is information that is already public knowledge, and the financial contributions that they would have made to the electoral campaigns of Cristina Fernández de Kirchner and Inácio Lula da Silva himself in Brazil are being investigated, who is readjusting his position, seeking to achieve a delicate balance in the new geopolitical scenario. In Colombia, the authorities have discovered a dangerous alliance between Hezbollah and local cartels. They not only share drug trafficking routes, but they exchange tactics and resources, strengthening their illicit operations. This criminal symbiosis threatens to destabilize decades of fighting drug trafficking in the country. Peru faces a different challenge. Hezbollah cells have infiltrated legitimate businesses, creating a sophisticated money laundering network. They have also established an extortion system that terrorizes local merchants and businessmen, spreading fear in major cities. Chile, traditionally a bastion of stability, now finds itself in Hezbollah's crosshairs. The organization has taken advantage of the complexities of the migration crisis to establish a discreet but growing presence. Using false identities, its operatives have blended in with the population, challenging Chilean security systems. Most alarming is the denial or downplaying of this threat by some Latin American governments. The reasons vary: fear of diplomatic reprisals, underestimation of Hezbollah's operational capacity, or even ideological alignments with countries such as Iran, which facilitate infiltration into student populations by taking advantage of the discontent generated among young people by Israel's attacks. This ostrich-like attitude allows the terrorist organization to continue expanding its influence unhindered. Hezbollah's network in Latin America is vast and complex. From Mexico to Argentina, they have woven connections with local criminal groups, creating an infrastructure that allows them to operate with relative freedom. This network not only serves as financing, but could be the base for future terrorist attacks in the region. A Latin American country is prepared to face this threat. The evidence suggests not. The lack of regional cooperation, political divisions, and the scarcity of anti-terrorist resources make the continent fertile ground for Hezbollah operations. Every day that passes without decisive action, Hezbollah consolidates its presence on our continent. The security of millions of Latin Americans is truly at risk. In several countries with leaders who call themselves progressive, they saw that what began with solidarity with the people of Palestine ended up being a breeding ground for the recruitment of possible local cells, and now they are trying to put a stop to something that they do not know how far it spread. The relationship between Iran and Hezbollah is much more than a simple ideological alliance. It is a strategic partnership that has found a new field of expansion in Latin America. We want to make clear how Iran uses Venezuela as its platform of operations in the region, because this creates a threat that goes beyond Venezuelan borders. Iran has established a network of covert operations in Venezuela that challenges the continent's security in the search for external attack targets for its war with Israel. The Maduro regime, isolated and desperate, has opened the doors wide to Iranian influence, even indoctrinating Venezuelans against a cause they only embrace for economic convenience. But this is not simple cooperation between nations. Intelligence sources have revealed the existence of secret pacts that include the exchange of military technology, collaboration in nuclear programs, and the establishment of bases for Iranian agents on Venezuelan territory. The presence of these agents in Venezuela is a documented fact. They are not limited to diplomatic or commercial activities. They are involved in intelligence tasks, militia training, and coordination of illicit activities in conjunction with Cuba. Their objective: to expand Iranian influence in the region and create a network that can be activated at any time. And what is behind this strategy? Iran is playing a long-term geopolitical game. It seeks to create a counterweight to US influence in what has traditionally been considered Washington's backyard. By establishing a strong presence in the region, Iran not only gains strategic allies, but also creates a potential conflict zone that could distract and weaken its Western adversaries. But there is more. Iran's presence in Latin America serves as an insurance policy against possible hostile actions against it. The ability to operate close to US borders provides Iran with a strategic advantage and an additional deterrent factor in its global confrontations. Donald Trump's administration has already warned that it will not underestimate this threat. The so-called hawks in his administration consider it a multifaceted challenge that requires a coordinated and determined response from the international community. As long as Iran continues to use Venezuela as its platform in America, the stability and security of the entire region will be at risk. Many citizens of Latin America are already asking themselves with some helplessness, how long will this threat be allowed to grow silently, right under our noses? The international response to the Venezuelan crisis revealed an alarming global fragmentation. The division between powers had paralyzed any effective action against the Maduro regime. Russia and China, key allies of the Venezuelan government, systematically blocked initiatives in the UN Security Council, providing a diplomatic shield that allowed the regime to operate with impunity. With the change of government in the United States, the position is set to harden dramatically. In Latin America, the situation was no different. The region was fractured. Some countries, out of ideological affinity, refused to condemn Maduro. Others, fearful of an even greater migration crisis, adopted a lukewarm stance. This lack of regional cohesion left the population of Venezuela adrift, sinking deeper and deeper into chaos. Governments such as those of Argentina, Uruguay, and El Salvador have been very clear about the Maduro government. It is an illegitimate dictatorship that commits state terrorism against its population, which is why they are strongly pushing for the popular will of the elections of July 28 to be respected, in which the people elected Edmundo González Urrutia as president. The United States, despite its traditional aggressive rhetoric, has been failing to generate real change, and that has delayed the formation of an international coalition that could take on the issue with real conviction, and without the brakes of false progressivism that ends up justifying with its silence a state terrorism that is not condemned by countries such as Mexico, Colombia, Nicaragua, and Brazil. But the urgency of the issue cannot tolerate the hypocrisy of those presidents with double standards who think that exile, persecution, kidnapping, imprisonment, and death are wrong, but only when it is in countries with an ideology opposite to their own. This obvious hypocrisy was also exposed, and in recent meetings, the issue is being reviewed with a more aggressive stance. The United States had already imposed sanctions that, although forceful on paper, were easily circumvented by a regime that demonstrates an astonishing capacity for adaptation. The Venezuelan government, with its network of alliances with countries like Iran, which has all the experience of clandestinely managing funds for its terrorist forces, was already finding new ways to sustain its economy and mock international pressure. So the Trump administration is expected to be much tougher and more effective in applying measures. International law was powerless in the face of this crisis in Venezuela. Designed for conflicts between states, it has no tools to confront a government that openly harbors terrorist groups like Hezbollah. National sovereignty, a fundamental principle of this law, has become the perfect shield for Maduro and his circle to operate without consequences. The allied countries, which receive illegal money and finance their electoral campaigns with this traffic, hide behind this same argument to avoid condemning what is their own business. Once again, Maria Corina Machado's contribution exposing the scandalous fraud was a powerful contribution for the world. It exposes that if Nicolás Maduro intends to perpetuate himself beyond the current period, he is in a clear and unconstitutional usurpation of power and is enabled to be detained by force for the crimes already committed and for which he was convicted by the International Criminal Court, which issued an international arrest warrant and set a reward. Starting on January 10, 2025, anyone who catches him and takes him to court can collect the reward. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking, and that is why each day of inaction allows the regime to deepen its ties with international terrorism, turning Venezuela into a growing threat for the entire region. The international community debates, issues empty declarations, but the reality on the ground continues to worsen. What is needed to break this impasse? The solution is not simple, but it is urgent. An approach is required that overcomes ideological divisions and prioritizes regional security over individual geopolitical interests, smart and joint sanctions, real support for the opposition forces that won the elections democratically in Venezuela, higher rewards for the capture of criminals, and coordinated and very firm diplomatic pressure so that the person who was elected and demonstrated it by making the minutes public can assume the presidency. And there are uncomfortable questions that we must ask ourselves. How many more lives must be lost? How much more must the situation deteriorate before the world reacts effectively? Inaction is not only a diplomatic failure, it is a direct threat to the stability of all Latin America. The real consequences of this international paralysis that allowed this threat to spread are already palpable, and every day counts in the fight against a regime that has kidnapped an entire nation. The future of Latin America is experiencing a period of strong decisions and drastic changes that some cannot fully visualize. Figures such as Maria Corina Machado, Nayib Bukele, and Javier Milei dared to challenge a previous situation that seemed to be the condemnation of their country. And yet, they are achieving unprecedented transformations. This influence is radiating to the entire region and especially to its people who are supporting them beyond what the press buys with advertising says. While it has become clear that leaders such as Ignacio Lula da Silva, Gustavo Petro, and now Claudia Sheinbaum will not provide support and will behave in the face of the situation in Venezuela more like allies of the dictator Maduro and on the same level as the Cuban Miguel Díaz-Canel and the Nicaraguan Daniel Ortega. The reality is that the other countries in the region understand the seriousness of the threat and are willing to define effective strategies that will exhaust the diplomatic route so as not to delay the use of force. International cooperation is no longer an option, it is a vital necessity. The democratic countries of the region must unite as never before, sharing intelligence reports, coordinating operations, strengthening judicial and financial institutions. All of this is crucial to cutting off the power of these criminal groups. But the fight is not limited to the security forces. The entire region must decide to attack the causes that allow these groups to flourish. Poverty, inequality, lack of opportunities. These are the real enemies that must be defeated. How? By supporting democratic governments, promoting transparency, strengthening the rule of law, and isolating those who promote contrary values. The sovereignty of a people is sacred, and Maduro violated it to perpetuate himself in a domain that has been oppressed for 25 years, with proven accusations and exercising state terrorism against a population that has already exhausted all constitutional mechanisms to express that it does not want him in the presidency. They made their choice, and their elected president had to take refuge outside the country. The international status that Nicolás Maduro and all his high officials managed to achieve is that of a gang of criminals who illegally appropriated the state, violating the popular will of the sovereign people, and who, through their drug trafficking and terrorism activities, generate an enormous risk on the continent. President-elect Donald Trump was quick to calm Latin American demands to work together, announcing Marco Rubio as Secretary of State precisely to give a clear signal that the United States is joining an international action coordinated with the International Criminal Court to free the people of Venezuela and allow their elected president to take office. He also expressed a very clear message that the drug cartels have attacked the United States, and now it will be the United States that attacks the cartels. These statements go directly to Vladimir Padrino, Diosdado Cabello, and Nicolás Maduro himself, who as leaders of the Cartel de los Soles already have an arrest warrant and $1 million reward. The high officials are considered to be working in partnership with the Mexican cartels of Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation that together have generated a true scourge in American society. The most recent data indicate that in the United States, overdose deaths were more than 107,000 people in 2023 and are double the figures recorded 5 years ago, which reflects the seriousness of the problem and the risk of not combating it urgently. The American Senator Rick Scott requested that the rewards for the capture of Nicolás Maduro and all the convicted officials be substantially increased, explaining that the funds to pay them will come from the seizures of money from drug trafficking, which allows us to anticipate what is coming to the regime. Intelligence reports show a strong presence in Venezuela of members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, a special forces corps that was already involved in assassination attempts against Donald Trump, in retaliation for the death of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in January 2020, and that the United States accuses them of a new attempt that was deactivated 4 days after the elections, according to the Department of Justice. This recent situation caused Trump himself to anticipate to his team that he will increase sanctions against Iran, both on its oil trade front and on the development of its nuclear program as a way to curb its influence in the Middle East, but also in Venezuela. The presence of Iranians in the Caribbean is something that will raise the level of aggressiveness on this front. It is notable how the population of the long-suffering Venezuelan people has been losing hope, believing that Nicolás Maduro's maneuver is an irreversible fact and that once again fraud and lies prevailed over their will. But they are very wrong. Like a dough that is rising, the election of a new president in the United States was the last link in a chain of events necessary to activate an effective plan against Maduro. Maria Corina Machado has already done all the necessary internal work, so now she is well protected, coordinating the end of the strategy that involves the inevitable external help. The confidentiality of the meetings maintains the hermeticism, but the frequency of the meetings and the attendees allow us to infer the topics that are being discussed. Eric Prince has already had at least 2 meetings with Donald Trump, and nobody believes that they are talking about cooking recipes. Maduro's entourage is very scared. It is noticeable in the nervousness of the Rodriguez brothers and in the more conciliatory messages of Nicolás Maduro himself towards Trump. They know that the time is coming and that there will be no room for negotiation. The threat of Venezuela being kidnapped by the electoral fraud committed by Maduro is a reality that, in addition to the internal conflicts, an issue exclusive to Venezuelans and which the regime did not respect, has its consequences for the rest of the region due to the illicit activities they carry out, and it is from there that the full weight of the international response will come. As we have been saying in previous reports, the most complex responsibility will be borne by the non-corrupt members of the armed forces who, one day least expected and without prior notice, will have to decide whether they are with the sovereign people who democratically elected change or with the narco-state on the verge of disappearing as such. Today, more than ever, we must listen to and follow Maria Corina Machado, leader to the end, because the end of this long dictatorship is closer than ever. Share this video. It is the worst thing you can do to the regime.